Hello, my name is Eri Redboard, Head of Legal and Government Affairs at TRM Labs. Welcome to TRM Talks. TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. Today, pack your bags because we are traveling. We've been talking about the travel rule in crypto compliance circles for years, but in the last few months, we have seen FATF amplify its call for implementation, and we have seen global regulators begin to demand and enforce compliance. Where are we today, and where are we headed on the travel rule? Today, TRM talks to Pele Brandgard, CEO and co-founder of Nota Bene, Tamsin Harrison, Senior Legal Associate at Luno, and Malcolm Wright of Enofi Advisory and Global Digital Finance. Listen up and don't get called for traveling. Thank you, Gal, so much for joining me in all these different time zones. I'm really excited to have your expertise on this panel today. Before we venture down the travel rule rabbit hole, I would love to start hearing about your own travels, your own journeys to crypto. Tamsin, would you tell us a little bit about your journey and what you do now at Luno?
Sure. So I guess my journey to crypto started at about 2017 when my husband built a arbitraging bot. And then I joined Luno in 2018. There were only about 80 people in the company at the time. And today we close to 800. We've got 9 million customers around the world. In my role, I do a little bit of everything, mostly licensing and regulatory work. The travel rule in particular sort of landed on my desk towards the end of 2019 as we were preparing to license in Singapore, which was one of our first countries to require the travel rule, and it requires full compliance in order to operate. And then since then, I've been heavily involved in evaluating the different solutions, developing our own compliance framework, working with our product and engineering teams to build this out, and of course scaling the travel rule into our new markets.
Fantastic. Yeah, really excited to hear from you today. I think one of the challenges at a panel like this is always how do we kind of dig into the nuts and bolts? What should a compliance program have? And I'm excited to do that a little bit with you today. Pele, you have lived and breathed the travel rule. Talk a little bit. Would love to hear about your own travel, your own journey to crypto.
Yeah, so I actually started back in the .com era with what was then known as financial cryptography, working on a lot of early predecessors to crypto. Also went through banking a bit, and when Bitcoin came out, I dropped everything and went full on with that. My first company in the space was Kipochi, which was the first Bitcoin wallet that was primarily focused at sub-Saharan Africa. We were also the first of several companies that got thrown out of M-Pesa. So in the crypto space. So I've been through a journey like so many others in the space have. But really, primarily, I've been focused on identity, figuring out how identity fits in to crypto, and particularly in the compliance aspect, and how we can use identity in a way that still fits in with the overall ethics and philosophy and ideology around public blockchains. And travel rule is really, one of these aspects where you can do it in a nice, ethical, good, privacy-preserving way, or you can do it a completely different kind of way. And our team, our founding team, we worked together on building some of this lower-level technology around identities and blockchain, and we've been really focused on the last 2 years on solving the travel rule. When we saw the FATF guidelines, we saw this is actually one of the key problems. And it's not so much just a technical issue, it's more an operational issue. So our team, I think one of the things that's really differentiated us is that we spend a lot of time working with Tamsin and many other people to actually figure out what are the actual tasks involved to do this. And it's not just a technical protocol.
Yeah, no, really well said. And it's interesting. Like I've been thinking about some time about a TRM talks on identity and privacy alone, right? I mean, these issues are so front and center in anything that we talk about in the space right now. So yeah, no, really excited to dig into the solution. Malcolm, when I left the government and sort of went down the crypto compliance rabbit hole, people said the first person you need to speak to is Malcolm Wright. You've really been in this space a long time and have really been a leader and focused in it. Talk about sort of how did that happen? Talk a little bit about your journey.
I apologize to everybody listening if I suddenly start coughing. It's been a funny week for coughs, and it's not COVID, thank God. Okay, so no, thank you, Ari. That's a great welcome. Yes, so I kind of moved into crypto. I guess I was working for Revolut in London, just at the point where they introduced crypto as a technology as a means to be able to save Bitcoin and other crypto. I then moved to Hong Kong. I went to Equinix, which was was the first NASDAQ listed crypto exchange, but they also did asset management. So we got asset management license for a fund of crypto hedge funds. And then to BitMEX last year, just at the point where they needed some assistance from me, and then most recently sort of moved out into sort of running my own advisory, where as part of that I'm also head of strategy now for Shift Veriscope, which is a decentralized travel rule protocol. So very similar to sort of as Pelle's been saying, we're trying to fix this problem that's been around and trying to do that in very much in a privacy preserving way. That's also going to be future-proof. Now, alongside all of this, I was very busy during the day, but I thought, okay, what can I do in my evenings? So I got involved in global digital finance about 3.5 years ago, maybe 4. And GDF.io is the website, and it's an industry body which is looking at best practices and standards in crypto. And so as part of this, I started running the AML working group. That led me to conversations with the FATF and with regulators at the point where they said, hey, we've got this thing called crypto that we're going to, or virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. What does this world look like? And I was really acting with the industry to help promote the education from the industry side, but also the education from the FATF and regulatory side back to the industry, almost a two-way flow of information. And that's continued even until today. We had the final guidance from FATF last year, but there's still so much more to do. As we move into full implementation, what that looks like, the challenges that we're going to talk about today. But certainly it's been quite a journey. That did also include the data storage, the messaging format that all of the solutions now use, called IVMS 101, which we sort of co-founded and brought together. And that was an amazing feat event of collaboration between 135 technical experts around the world, including Pelle and the team there, to really sort of drive forward this standard messaging format, so that we can all look at how we can work together, because we all saw that there was going to be more than one travel rule protocol solution, and how can we actually make this work between all of us. And the starting point was really, let's get a messaging format that helps to drive all of that.
That's really cool. And you raised something that I think is really interesting that's worth pointing out. This panel is almost sort of a continuation of something we did a few months ago. We sat down with the chairs of the Virtual Asset Contact Group within FATF that essentially wrote this final guidance that Malcolm referenced. And really sort of I asked at the end, the last question was like, so what's next? You guys did this thing that you've probably been working on for 2 years. What's next? And they said travel rule implementation, essentially, that we're going to go all over the world now. And this is going to be sort of the travel rule world tour. I was like, expecting t-shirts or something. But, I think that really implementation is the focus. So immediately there we said, well, we need to talk to the experts on sort of what that really looks like in the world today. And that's really what this was born out of. Malcolm, I'm going to stay with you for just one moment, because I think we're missing something very important here. And that is, what exactly is the travel rule? Would you sort of lay it out? I've been doing videos with my kids and throwing footballs and basketballs all week, trying to simplify this concept for folks. But could you give me your best sort of 2-minute version?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah, they're great videos, by the way. I enjoyed them. Okay, so in the traditional banking world, we've seen sort of wire transfer regulations in place for some time. So 20 odd years, where you have the SWIFT network, for example, and every time a payment is sent over a certain threshold, details about that payment, who the originator is, who the beneficiary is, are sent between the banks that are involved in that transaction, including where there might be correspondent banks along the way. What the travel rule is the crypto equivalent of that. So it's exactly the same. We have transactions over a certain threshold where information will be sent from one, let's say, exchange or custodian. In FATF terminology, that's a VASP or virtual asset service provider. That information has to travel with the crypto payment. So as much as if I'm sending, somebody Bitcoin, my details will be sent to that other person's exchange, and vice versa. A certain amount of information may come back to enable that information to be shared. The purpose of this is not because we all want to give away our data and privacy and all of that kind of stuff. The purpose of this is really to say, okay, if law enforcement want to go knocking on the door and say, hey, tell me about that transaction, they can go to any point, an exchange or a custodian, get the information they need that will help them with their investigations. And that could be money laundering, or it could be sanctions. And we've seen all of this. Now, Ari, as I'm sure you've sort of said many times, crypto is not inherently bad. When you look at the rate of crime, it's low, but at the same time, there is still a material risk that our regulators felt needed to be closed. So our travel rule was actually born out of a US terminology. In the US, it's been within the FinCEN remit and the BSA since 2013, but it's still on that implementation path. Now, what we're now seeing is regulators around the world starting to bring this in. So you see it in Korea, you see it in Europe, and we see it in Singapore, and coming in other jurisdictions as well. And it's very much this, how do we send this information? It's technically complex. It's not like a bank account where you could say, okay, if I looked at an IBAN, I have the bank, the branch, the account number, I've got all those details embedded in that string of information. When you're looking at a crypto address, it's just random letters and numbers. There's no way to infer who owns that address. So that's one of the biggest technical complexities.
That's an amazing, I feel like that's an amazing jumping off point, because Pele, this is exactly the problem. I mean, Malcolm, thank you for the setup, right? Like, so this is exactly the problem that you set out to solve. And we talk about Nota Bene as a travel rule solution. Sort of, what is the problem, and what is that? And I think Malcolm sort of set that up in terms of the technical problem. But what is the problem, and how are you guys solving it?
Yeah, so the initial problem is exactly where Malcolm left it. It's like, who is behind this address? Which VASP is there to be able to start connecting with them? So this is one of the first parts of it. And there isn't really a perfect solution for this right now, but this is what we call wallet identification. And it's just the first part of it. And also where our integration with TRM, for example, works. So in many cases, if our joint customers are able to get an answer from TRM has identified this address as belonging to a particular VASP. That's great, because then we already know that. But in cases of fresh addresses, there's no actual way of understanding who's behind that. So there we get into we have a UX aspect of it as well, where we ask a customer, similar to where in a bank, you can ask for like a SWIFT code or BIC code or something like that when you're doing a wire transfer. So we have a similar UX aspect. And at this point, it's just, self-reported, right? It's not enough to complete the travel, but it's enough to get started. The next big, we see there are 4 big operational buckets, and really the complexity of the travel rule is it's a large issue because it touches many different points, from both an operational, from a product, from a compliance. There's a whole bunch of new tasks that no one's really had to do before in the past, and I'm sure Tamsin can get into those aspects later. But the way we kind of bucket it is wallet identification, counterparty due diligence, the messaging aspect of it, like how do you actually get the travel rule message to the other VASP, and then different scalability tools such as rule engines to be able to actually do this at scale, because there are a lot of decisions that you have to make for each transaction. So we are a end-to-end travel rule solution that's focused on that entire aspect of it. And the travel rule protocols, where there's been a lot of industry focus on that, sits in the messaging aspect of it. Some of them have a smaller due diligence aspect for it as well, but that's one part of it, but it's only really one part of implementing the travel rule. There's a lot more to it. Again, as I'm sure Tamsin knows, because I've followed Tamsin's journey, like with her implementing it within Luno, it's not necessarily an easy task.
That's terrific. Yeah, I want to know sort of where VASPs are globally, but I think actually that's a great entree into sort of what Tamsin's doing, because basically what we've heard about is sort of what this is, what are the challenges, and sort of what are we building to solve it. And then I think, Tamsin, I'd love to sort of dig in with you about sort of how you're thinking about it at Luno and how you're sort of building this type of, what risk-based compliance, travel rule compliance, essentially.
Sure. So I guess generally we've always looked at banks and traditional finance players to formulate our approach to compliance. But we also need to recognize that our compliance program needs to make sense for crypto. So on travel rules specifically, of course, we support the FATF's extension of the travel rule to the crypto industry and the objectives for doing so. But I think, no doubt, like many of the businesses on the call today, we've also had to navigate the difficulty of applying this to the crypto industry. So I think there are a few sort of key pillars to the approach that we have taken. The first is that we've needed to factor in the sunrise problem. So our approach recognizes that many of our VASP counterparties just will not respond to us or interact with us the way that travel rule is intended to work. And ultimately, it's going to take some time for the industry to be fully up and running. Secondly, we've also built our program with certain core requirements in place, but also the ability to localize depending on the in-country requirements. So, for example, the whole idea of the travel rule is that you now know more about your counterparty. So the various checks and screening that you can do on your counterparty become a core requirement to how businesses will manage transactions. Then localizing may involve collecting different information depending on the different country, and also factoring in things like a de minimis threshold. So, for example, Singapore asks you to collect certain additional information if the value of the transaction is above 1,500 Singapore dollars, whereas in countries like Malaysia, there isn't a threshold. And the other thing that we're seeing on the localization front is that different countries also have different approaches to unhosted wallets. And then finally, sort of third pillar is at the center of our approach is always the customer's experience and making it as easy as possible to comply with these additional requirements. So we're really aware that this is a significant change for customers, and we spend and customers are unlikely to know the beneficiary information that we are now asking for. So customer education and great UX becomes really important here.
Tamsin, I'm going to stay with you for one moment because I think you were digging into something that has a name, and we hear it all the time in terms of, we hear it called the sunrise issue or the sunrise problem. And I think you were getting a little bit to it when you have compliant VASPs essentially interacting with non-compliant VASPs. Would you build on that description a little bit and sort of talk a little bit about what that is and maybe how you're dealing with it? Just as a jumping off point also, there's a question that just popped up in the Q&A about what do you do when you return an incoming transfer from a VASP that is not sending travel rule data along with that transfer?
Sure. So the sunrise issue is where some countries have implemented travel rule, but others haven't, which makes the whole system of working as optimally as possible. It makes it really difficult. And in terms of dealing with dealing with VASPs in countries that may or may not have applied the travel rule, that's an important consideration that you do need to factor into designing your compliance program. And you need to decide from a risk-based perspective whether to allow transactions with that VASP on the basis that they, may be a bit slower, or are you going to take a firm approach and not facilitate transactions with a VASP in a country where it hasn't been implemented? If you are choosing strict compliance, but it's really up to you and your risk-based approach and how you want to design it.
Again, with this risk-based approach, right? Malcolm, sort of building on that a little bit. You're advising VASPs in the space all the time through GDF and through your advisory and in other sort of ways. Digging into this a little bit, sort of, what is an appropriate sort of risk-based approach in dealing with non-compliant VASPs in a travel rule scenario?
So it's really going to come down to each country's implementation. So there's two ways in which you can get caught by needing to do travel rule. The first one is you're required to do it because you're regulated, or because the country in which you operate from requires you to do it. The second is if you want to interact with a VASP that has to do it, is also required to do it. So you may get caught as being a VASP that you end up doing travel rule, even if you're not required to do it from a regulatory perspective, just so that you can stay in the game. Now, a lot could come down to, if you're looking at a risk-based approach, you would say, okay, if the FATF guidance talks about doing due diligence on your VASP counterparties, so are you going to share information with another counterparty VASP? And you might say, okay, some of them I'm willing to, some of them I'm not. So the ability to select who you're going to send travel rule information to could be based on your due diligence questionnaire, or background information that you obtain, and so on. Or you may choose initially just to say, I'm only going to be, for example, transacting information with Singapore. Now, that will also then come down to the regulator's expectation. So a regulator may say, you should treat counterparties that you haven't done due diligence with, you should treat them as being higher risk, or maybe not transact at all. It could vary from where you are. Returning a payment, that's much harder. And the reason that's harder is because very often when you receive a payment, it could come from an omnibus address on an exchange. So if you send it back, it's very difficult to work out exactly where it's going back to. So I think returning is still something that needs to be solved. What you can do on deposit, if you receive a deposit, but you don't receive VASP information that comes with it, you can ask your customer as well. So you can go to your customer and say, hey, tell me about this deposit, because before I put it in your account, I want you to tell me everything about it, who it's from, and so on and so on. Maybe it's come from an unhosted wallet. Regarding the Sunrise issue, there is solutions, and I'd be remiss not to sort of mention that what we're doing with Shift Varioscope is we have actually put together a solution that kind of solves for this asymmetric issue of one party having to do it, one party not, being able to sort of say, okay, this is how we balance the world, so that at a future point in time when everybody's on the network, you can retrospectively build your transaction history that you may then need for your regulatory purposes and so forth. So there is a mechanism to now do that, and that's something that we've been working very hard to achieve. But all in all, I think that we're looking very much at this asymmetry will start to accelerate over the course of this year, and working out the risk around where's the VASP located. Do they have an AML policy? What's their reputation in the market? All sorts of things like that will help to give an indication. Plus, of course, using tools like TRM to actually look at the risk exposure when you're looking at the transactions in and transactions out. Where are those transactions flowing? Are they going to apparently legitimate sources, or are they going to illegitimate sources, illicit sources? So you can use a lot of different data points and approaches to work out, am I actually going to transact with an exchange or not?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And what I think I'm hearing there is that a risk-based approach is not just on a VASP by VASP basis, but it's also obviously a jurisdictional question. And
correct.
Let me kind of move over to you. So I love the timing of this panel because you guys put out what I really consider to be sort of the most robust discussion on the travel rule in really some time, if ever, last week. So it's sort of a really great opportunity as you have all this data fresh in your head. But I guess a couple questions. One, I was going to ask you earlier, sort of if you would go through with us a little bit about what travel rule implementation looks like globally. But then if you sort of want to also discuss some of the key takeaways of that report, that would be fantastic. And we're going to dig in a little bit more to the report, over the course of the conversation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a very interesting report, and I recommend anyone can go to the Nota Bene website and download it themselves afterwards to look through it. But there are some really some key takeaways in there. So obviously, we're seeing in it that it is difficult, and there's a lot of uncertainty around how to approach implementing the travel rule. But there's also a very strong willingness to do so, to implement it. And this report is data that it's a survey that we ran in Q4, and in that around 70% of VASPs plan to be live with the travel rule by Q2 at the latest, which I think is very, very positive on there. And also a fair amount are already receiving travel rule transactions. Then of like about 20% of VASP are receiving travel rule transactions today. Of those, a good about half are actively responding, and the other half are kind of maybe a little bit in the headlights, like, what do I do with this kind of situation yet? So trying to evaluate that, and it's right to be careful and understand what it means. But we are seeing that the people are trying to move forward with it, and the two big questions or uncertainties that people are having is the sunrise issue, how to deal with that, and on regulatory clarity. But there's another slight side issue here to some really new dynamics that are happening in the market that is kind of related to the sunrise issue, but is having slightly different effect than what we assumed it would have had like 6 months to a year ago, where for most of the time, everyone's been focused on what does my regulator say?
Yeah.
And that's the obvious, that's where you're going to start. If no one else is implementing the travel rules, that's where you're going to start. But now there's some other market dynamics happening. So there are a couple of large jurisdictions, important jurisdictions like Korea, who are mandating it by March. That means if you have significant transaction volume going to Korea, you have to be live with the travel rule or you will lose that transaction volume. And we're actually seeing this is moving people much quicker to adopt, where for a while it's been a little bit wait and see, to what our regulators are saying. They're giving us an additional 6 months, 12 months, but now people are moving a lot quicker.
Who would have ever thought that the market actually motivates people to do things, right? The regulators could, hit their head against the wall for 3 years on this, and then the market dictates what ultimately happens. That's really well said, really interesting. Yeah.
So that's like the biggest market change that we're seeing right now. And I'd actually say a lot of our customers and a lot of people that we've signed up in the last 3 months are in jurisdictions where their regulators are, take another year or something like that to do so. But what's really motivating right now is loss of transaction volume. And this is where, this risk-based approach, we like to use this term, but it really comes in because we have to start really, managing the business side with the compliance risk aspect of it. And it also allows you, if you start focusing on that, because if you're not that worried about your regulator right now, it allows you to take a slightly more business-focused way of implementing it rather than on the compliance risk, right? So it gives you a certain luxury to be able to build it slowly, understand it before you actually start denying transactions without travel rule. Which is the ultimate goal of the regulation, is really to have very strict transactions, right?
No, absolutely. Tamsin, just building on that a little bit, I think that one thing that Pele is really getting to is that we're going to start to see more and more VASPs from all different sizes, right, either have to or want to comply for market reasons. What are the challenges there, or are there any immediate challenges?
Yeah, so I mean that stat that Pele mentioned, around 70% of the respondents looking to become compliant in Q1 or Q2 is very interesting. And I guess if any businesses on the call today have not yet started with that process, I think one of the key messages I would share is that it may take longer than you expect to implement, and there definitely are some hurdles that you may encounter. So firstly, I mean, there has been a fair amount of resistance from the industry about this concept of the travel rule to applying it to our industry. And you may well encounter that same resistance within your organization. Secondly, there is still a fair amount of regulatory uncertainty about certain aspects of the travel rule, either generally or specific to in-country legislation. And this can make it quite challenging to define what you need from your development team. So, for example, there's some uncertainty around which countries' requirements do you apply for cross-border transactions, or what do you do about transactions within the same group? And then the third sort of hurdle, there's a ton of compliance decisions and the nuts and bolts that you really do need to work through, and compliance decisions that you need to grapple with at every step of the way. So it is really important to start today, start shaping something internally, and also engage with other exchanges, because I think we are all in this together, and it is really good to share learnings with one another.
That's really, really well said. Pele, just sort of back to you for a moment. I think one thing the report talks about is jurisdictional implementation, sort of jurisdiction by jurisdiction, which is sort of very cool. Obviously not going around the world, but what are the important jurisdictions that we should be reading? If folks are looking to really understand this space, what are the regulators whose guidance and advisories and laws for certain jurisdictions should we be reading on travel rule and even compliance more broadly? What are the important jurisdictions right now in the space?
So I think it's definitely important to look at what MAS is doing in Singapore, because they've been ahead of the curve on many things. FINMA and Switzerland have also been ahead of things, of a lot of this regulation. But what I think it's really interesting to see is what's happening in the US, what's happening in some of the larger APEC jurisdictions like South Korea and Japan as well, where there are strict guidelines in place, but the industry together with regulators are still kind of struggling with how do we actually do this with these tight deadlines. I think the US VAS have a little bit of a luxury, like with FinCEN being a little bit more hands off on things, even though I do understand that they're pushing things a lot more right now. But you really have to look around to see the slight differences on it. But one thing I have noticed is that there is a general trend with most major jurisdictions is to try to actually follow the FATF guidelines as much as possible, because they're starting, the initial implementations, for example, may have started off without understanding the global aspect of it. But what I'm actually seeing with a lot of the ones who are coming out with implementations now is that they're matching way more directly to the FATF guidelines. And I think as a whole, it's a good idea to just kind of plan on implementing it based on the overall FATF guidelines, and then we're working on technical solutions to be able to handle the slight differences between, say, MAS and US and some of those kinds of things, because those are solvable. But if you look at the FATF guidelines themselves as a guiding force, because that's really more and more of the regulation we're seeing just follows it pretty much to the T, just from a high level.
That's really helpful. Tamsin, I'm going to go with you, and Malcolm, I'd love you to kind of follow up on what you're hearing from VAS that you work with. I think one thing we've heard over the years is that, obviously there's tremendous cost and burden associated with building out a robust sort of risk-based compliance program writ large, but really bringing in a travel rule solution and blockchain intelligence like TRM. Sort of, there are costs associated with this. What when you talk to folks who are peers in the industry, what are you kind of hearing about what it takes to build something like this out? For Tamsin, if you would kick that off.
Sure. So, I mean, any kind of regulation does, of course, come with additional costs and resources. But I think ultimately what we need to remember, if we want crypto to be available to the mass market, then regulation is really important to get us there. And so I think instead of sort of resisting any incoming regulation, the emphasis needs to be on advocating for good regulation. And that, of course, benefits both consumers as well as crypto businesses. And I think this is why it's so important for the industry to strengthen relationships with local regulators and help educate regulators about the industry, particularly about travel rule and what the issues are there, to ensure that the regulation coming out is ultimately fit for purpose, doesn't stifle new entrants coming in, and make sense in the space.
And just sort of a corollary question to that, what you are constantly having to do as a compliance professional right now at a VASP, an attorney, is to, I'll use my Winter Olympics analogy because we're in there right now, but to skate to where the puck is headed, right? Because you really have to anticipate what's coming next from regulators. How do you prepare for that? Whether you're a compliance team or working with folks on the product side, how do you skate to where the puck is headed?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, that is really important. It is really important to try and anticipate where regulation is headed in order to effectively plan as an organization. But of course, I mean, many regulators engage with the industry from the initial policy phases, which is a very useful way to participate in the process from early on. And then I think particularly on the travel rule, the FATF's October guidance provides very useful insight in terms of where regulation is going. And Pele obviously touched on this a little bit earlier. I think in particular, the guidance includes this call to action from VASPs, which are located in countries which the travel rule has not yet been prescribed. And it says that the absence of local regulations does not preclude that VASP from beginning to implement some sort of travel rule measures. So this is definitely something that businesses may wish to start doing in anticipation of those local requirements coming in.
Terrific, thank you. Yeah, and Malcolm, just sort of following up with you. I mean, I've been on the GDF calls, for the last year and a half. You work with and represent some of the largest VASPs in the space. What are you sort of hearing are top of mind issues today? One observation I have, and I would love to get your take on this, I may be entirely wrong, but I think we're in a very different place than where we were a year ago, where the fight was against maybe the regulation or having to provide travel rule information itself. And now it's more, okay, we need to implement as quickly as possible, and it may take a little bit more time. Is that accurate, that shift? And maybe I would love to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's very much. I mean, I've been obviously a practitioner in all of this for sort of a few years as well, so I've sat on the front end. Yeah. I think going back to Tamsin's point, one of the important things is this whole public-private partnership. So GDF has been so effective because it's been forming this bond between the industry and regulators, and that's been vital to have that two-way bridge where you can actually have those conversations. And more of that, I think, is still to come, particularly as we move into implementation. What we're seeing is who's going first kind of thing, and in some cases it's being pushed by which jurisdictions you're in, but it's then who are your top counterparties, who are they going to use. So if you're working with the big B's, let's call them, of the top exchanges, then which solutions are they using? And it's working out things like that. And so what we're starting to see is this sort of conversation. I can speak with two hats. I can speak with GDF. I can speak with Shift. In terms of what we're seeing is that firms are starting to look for this more frictionless approach. They're looking at how can I do this with the least impact to my customers, the least cost to my customer. How do I make this, get this implemented? Do I now have to implement it all now? Can I implement parts of it now and then some later? Can I say, okay, I'm not required to do it, but I'm only going to do this for 1 or 2 jurisdictions first and pilot my way into it. So there's a number of different messages that I think are coming through, but there does seem to be this move from, a year ago where people were still saying, what's the travel rule and why, to very much, okay, we know what it is, but while we may not like the cost, we may not like the implementation, but it's going to add people, it's going to add technology, it's going to add other things, but it's still a necessary part of running a financial services business, which is what the industry is becoming. And even if we haven't even touched on the D word of DeFi yet, but even if we go down that road, we start to see that happening as well. And we're already having conversations with DeFi providers as well about how to bring them into this, into the travel rule network, because they see that actually if they don't have a travel rule solution in place to be able to interact with the centralized exchanges, and they don't have that protocol in place, then they could end up losing their liquidity, because it might be that all of a sudden it becomes too high risk, or it becomes outside, the boundaries of what regulators permit and so forth. So there is now this growing urgency. It's been part, I think, being driven by the work in Korea, which is, okay, come March, there has to be a travel rule implementation, but also by increasing pressure and increasing narrative from other jurisdictions that are starting to push this forward. The European Union, who are now sort of pushing something through the European Parliament for accelerating travel rule across the whole of Europe. We see all of this happening. So there's definitely this faster move towards implementing appropriate solutions and working out who's doing what, and starting to see how the puzzle starts to solidify, which I think is what's going to happen through Q2, Q3 towards the end of the year.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. And one question that's always top of mind for me, like you read the final guidance that came out of FATF, and there's a whole conversation on stablecoin issuers and DeFi protocols and NFT issuers and marketplaces. And it seems like, all right, so we have all these VASPs that are getting ready to implement travel rule. And then it's like, well, are we creating an entire new category, or categories, plural, of VASPs that are going to need to have these types of compliance controls in place? And if we have time, I would love to kind of hear on that, hear about that. And then then you sort of really got into sort of what's next, and we'll bust out the crystal ball in a moment and talk about sort of like what's coming. I think what's coming is probably very different than what was coming a year ago in this space, which is amazing. Pele, there's a question here that I think you'd be uniquely great to answer, and that is sort of how do you think about interoperability issues between different travel rule solutions? Obviously, you have a lot of clients in the space using Nota Bene. How are there issues when they are interacting with VASPs who are using other solutions, and kind of like, is that a problem?
Yeah, so interoperability is a little bit of a problem, or it may be a problem in the beginning. But one of the things that, as Malcolm talked about before, that a lot of the work that Malcolm led together with others in GDF in the past on IVMS 101 actually solves the hardest part of that. Now we have a common language to be interoperable with. And now when it comes to the different kinds of protocols, like the way we see ourselves is that we're not a protocol, we are an end-to-end solution that helps companies solve the travel rule and interact with all the other VASPs out there. So with that, we are taking care of the interoperability aspect of it through our travel rule switch. And so for the way that we see it, I mean, we don't think it's a great idea that there are 10 different travel rule protocols. That's not a good idea, but that's what often happens in the technical space. And we're trying not to create a new one, but we are trying to work with all the different protocols as they go live. Right now, it's been less of an issue than people may think, because there are only very few protocols that are actually live yet. But as some of the other protocols start going live, then you will need to be able to be interoperable with them. And that's where using an end-to-end solution provider like Nota Bene, we can go in and take care of that aspect for you to make sure you you have full interop. So we're already doing that today, using multiple different methods of sending transactions to different VASPs. Also, really, I mean, right now it's more like, as Malcolm was talking about, this what was the term you used? Asymmetric version of the travel rule in some respects, and our solution really handles that also, because we can send transactions to VASP who haven't started looking into implementing, and they get essentially a version of our dashboard to do so until they figure out how they do so more at scale as well. So interop, it's something the industry's been talking about. It will become an issue, but I think it's also something that will be solved. I think while there are multiple protocols, there'll probably become fewer protocols kind of by the end of the year. We're already seeing TRP and OpenVASP merging. I hope some of the others will merge as well. And then we may end up with just a small, like 2 or 3 of them.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's really, really helpful. We're going to get to some questions in a minute, but I really am anxious to kind of hear about what's next in your mind in the travel rule space, or even if you want to go more broadly into compliance and sort of where the regulations are headed. Tamsin, I know you had some thoughts on this, and would love to kind of get a sense from you of what's next. What is sort of top of mind for you right now in the compliance space?
Sure. So in terms of what to expect, I think we will obviously see a lot more countries adopting the travel rule, and hopefully what comes out is consistent with the October FATF guidance, as others have mentioned. And it is really important for creating an even playing field across different jurisdictions. And then in terms of, I think, what to keep top of mind going forward, it's really this point that I mentioned earlier around strengthening relationships with regulators, either directly or through industry bodies like the GDF or local associations.
That's fantastic. Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's interesting. I mentioned earlier when we sat down with the virtual asset contract group chairs, John Fishman and Takahide, I said sort of what's next. And really, as I mentioned, the focus is on implementation. And if you look at the last few, anything from FATF, right? Like even things that were not directly on this topic had the need for implementation of the travel rule in there. So it's going to be a huge focus. One thing that was interesting is there is some language in the final guidance around potentially allowing for some sort of staged or phased approach to travel rule implementation. So I asked about that specifically, and the answer I got was, what that means is that you need to be showing a serious effort towards implementation for a phased approach to be, something that is appropriate under the circumstances. So a phased approach does not mean sort of not doing anything for a while and then doing it. It means showing sort of a gradual move towards implementation. Pele, what's next? Sort of what's top of mind for you, and whether it's innovation in the space, which I know is obviously a focus for you, or sort of what's next from regulators.
So first of all, on the regulators, I think FATF in particular and other regulators like FinCEN have actually been very, very good, practical, and like what steps do we need to take to help the industry get forward. So they haven't. I mean, if you see the latest guidelines, as you said, they are trying to be helpful, like on these. How do we get there? Now, when it comes to what's next from the regulator, from the regulators, I think it's also fairly clear in there where they're trying to push the conversation. So like Malcolm was talking, what about DeFi? What about layer 2s? What about many of these different aspects of it? And this is where it becomes interesting, because yes, in theory, that means that DeFi protocols, if DeFi protocols are considered VASPs, they might have to implement the travel rule. But that FATF is not asking people to implement the travel rule to implement the travel rule. They're asking people to implement the travel rule to solve certain problems. And my understanding from most of the regulators that we're talking to, both on FATF side and different national regulators, that they're not going to try and force people to implement the travel rule for these, but they are going to look at what is it the travel rule is supposed to do, and how do you then apply that to within the context of a DeFi protocol or a token or a layer 2 or something like that. And I think this is the way that we need to look at this when we're skating to where the puck's going is not so much focus on the specific language, but focus on the intent and see where that's heading. And they talk a lot in the guidelines about a functional approach where you're not looking at if someone claims they're decentralized, that you're looking at what they do and then a couple of other tests there. So if you look at that, then you can probably guess if something might, in theory, be classified as a VASP, whether it is yet or not. And then you can start looking into what are they actually trying to do. And I think it's much better for us to look into the future and understand that the regulators know that this is a new rapidly going. They're not going to be, at least from the FATF point of view, I don't see them being unreasonable here. I actually see them being very, very open to discussions with the industry on how to do this, do things the right way. And I think this is just something where we have to be open. Regulators have to be open. In the past, they weren't, but I do feel they are being much more open now, at least some of the of the most important ones. And we also have to be a little bit open on our side for this dialogue to be able to get the industry to where we want it to go.
Yeah, no, really well said. And I'm very optimistic as well as sort of our ability to work with regulators and solve these issues. Malcolm, I think you got into some of this. In fact, I think you started to really throw out some of the questions around the final guidance and maybe how it applies to the travel rule, even outside of a travel rule context, right? Owner operator tests for DeFi, NFTs. What are you thinking about? Sort of what's top of mind for you in whether travel rule really more broad?
Yeah, just to pick up on Pele's point, actually, it really is around the focus on the activities. It's really not about what label you give yourself. So you could give yourself a label, hey, I'm DeFi, I'm therefore not covered. But actually, if you're doing an exchange of currency, or of two different crypto, then your activity would then lead down that path potentially. So focus on the functions, focus on the activities, but not necessarily on the label that you might choose, because that gives you the intent, as Pele said. I think what really is still on top of mind for when you look at regulators, there's a big shift at the moment towards consumer protection, which is something slightly different and probably out of the topic of this, but you see that happening quite heavily now. But really more, it's still things like VASP discovery. How do you work out who your counterparty VASP is? How do we solve for the sunrise problem? Because those are two of the biggest blockers. So with VASP discovery, how do I know who my counterparty VASP is? If you don't have full interoperability between the different protocols, so between Shift and Nota Bene or any of the others, then how can that bridge work between different protocols to say, well, VASP A can talk to VASP B and we can find each other. So being able to solve for that, which is something we've worked on, is quite key. Looking at it from the VASP side, it's still very much about how do I build that compliance program? How do I do that? And that's kind of what I've spent a lot of time doing is sort of how do you actually put in place those correct building blocks? And if you look at the FATF guidance last year, it actually gives you pretty much the basics of this is the building blocks you need to put in place, but then being able to do that in a frictionless way. So it has minimal impact on the customer. And thankfully, I came from a good let's say background on that. I worked for Revolut, where they're renowned for this relentless approach to frictionless customer experience. So that was a really good training ground for where we're trying to get to now, which is how do you build a frictionless customer experience, both for doing KYC, but also the next phase of that process, which is how do I now exchange travel, and can I do it without asking my customer for any information beyond where they want to send the payment, which is a focus, a kind of relentless focus now, is to get down that path that we can solve those particular issues.
That's fantastic, and honestly, a great jumping off point to a question for Tamsin in the chat, and Malcolm, this might be good for you too. Tamsin, what are the first steps towards implementing an internal compliance program for a VASP? Like you were getting into the nuts and bolts, which was so awesome. So other than picking up the phone and calling TRM, what are the next steps you do to build a crypto compliance program?
Sure. So I guess the first step is selecting a travel rule solution. And then, like Malcolm said, there are considerations there around interoperability and data protection and all sorts of things that you need to weigh up. But then over and above that, there is this huge piece of work involved in designing your internal compliance program. So, I mean, if I can list a few things to consider, the first would be solving how you are going to sanction screen the counterparty. So once you've engaged with your screening provider, you'll likely find that the information that you collect for travel rule purposes is not sufficient to perform an effective sanction screen on that counterparty. So you then need to think about collecting additional information on the counterparty and how the best way to collect that additional information would be. You also need to determine which risk indicators would lead you to cancel an outgoing transaction or attempt to reject an incoming transaction. And if you are able, or if you are unable to stop those funds from arriving, what are you going to do with those funds? You're also going to have to determine how to monitor incoming transactions that are missing the travel rule information, and what are you going to do about those transactions? And similarly, if you decide to restrict those funds from the customer, how long are you going to restrict the funds for? And what are you going to do with the funds if the information just simply never arrives? And then one other that comes to mind is obviously your approach to unhosted wallets, transactions with unhosted wallets, depending on those in-country requirements. So, for example, Singapore, Switzerland, Germany, they've all been quite prescriptive about the measures that you need to implement, and they require a proof of control from the wallet holder. But then other countries like Malaysia have followed the FATF guidance a lot closer, and they leave it up to a VASP to determine which types of enhanced measures to apply. And then finally, of course, now you need to hire and train a compliance team to deal with all of this stuff. So you need them to monitor queues, perform VASP due diligence, troubleshoot any problems. So there's a huge piece of sort of ongoing operations that needs to happen too.
Yeah, what I love so much about this question is, as you were answering it, Tamsin, I was looking around at you guys on the screen, and this is it right here, right? Like, to hear that from an internal compliance officer who's built a program, who's a lawyer, who understands the regulations, right? And then to hear from a travel rule solution like Nota Bene's, what you bring in right away sort of to address those issues. You have TRM, which is an AML compliance solution to understand sort of what are the risks of illicit actors. And then you bring in Malcolm to really sort of put in place the policies and procedures and advise on sort of what are best practices and how should a risk-based compliance program look like. So I think it's a really it's a great question. Thank you, Shanice, for asking it. And I think unfortunately we're out of time, but I just wanted to thank you guys so much. I mean, hopefully my last point hit that home. It's like, this is exactly the group you want to talk about this issue. And really grateful for you guys coming on today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. So look, thank you everyone for joining us for this really great discussion of the travel rule. We will be back later in the month with another TRM talk. So stay tuned for that. If you want to stay up with this nonstop cutting edge crypto content coming out of TRM, please subscribe to our newsletter, the weekly roundup, and stay tuned for next month's TRM talks. And until then, thank you all so much for being with us to build a safer financial system for billions of people.